Hi, my name is Zanny from Real Story, and today we're sitting down with Leessa Shannon. She works with business and industry leaders, helping them with their change communications. She also has the awesome privilege of working with the Australian of the Year finalists every year. Hi Leessa, can you tell us what kind of businesses you work with?
I work with corporate businesses and industry leaders, and I help them to clarify their communications, to work on their communication strategy and how to communicate their messages, mostly to inspire some level of change with their audiences.
And do you have a specific kind of process that you go through for that to happen?
You know, that answer's kind of twofold. One is yes and one is no. So yes, there is a structure, a very loose structure, which is, making sure that we really clarify their vision and understand what their objectives are, all the way through to refining and distilling their message, looking at the emotional journey that the audience will go on, and then the energy that they put out, so how they communicate. But in reality, everybody is different, and so it's going with the energy of the person that I'm working with, because one of the key things around communicating, I believe, is to keep the authenticity of the person and their personality. So whilst I have that structure, it's really quite fluid in the process.
Why would someone bring you into a company?
A lot of the time someone will bring me in because communication is the backbone of them being successful in a change that they want to create. The change might be a leader who has a new vision and wants to bring the team along on a ride. It might be that something needs to change because things are changing in the outside world. I mean, we've seen that so much this year. Or because they have an idea that they want to refine and get out there and inspire others to bring them on that journey. And they know that communicating is basically the make or break of how successful their project will be. So they bring me in to help them to be better at.
In your experience, what's the biggest challenge that they find about communicating?
Yeah, so in terms of the biggest challenges, I think the one that I see most often, maybe it's not the one that they initially see as the biggest challenge, it's that they've been living in this world of whatever their project is, and probably they're quite passionate about it, and they definitely are absorbed in it, and they have so much information that they try and put everything in. I think we have this misconception that more is better when it comes to communicating, and when they put so much information in, the message gets so muddied that we can't pull out the big part. So one of the biggest challenges I see is how to get a huge message down to something that's really simple to digest. Because when you think about trying to change someone's mind, so, taking someone on a new journey or introducing a new idea, typically your audience is going to be quite passive at that time. Their care factor is possibly quite low, at least when you start. So giving them too much information is just going to land on deaf ears. So it's really distilling it down into the most simple of messages.
What do you coach them to do when they're trying to make someone change their viewpoint on?
So there's two techniques that I love to use when we're doing this. And the first is to get them to buy a little packet of Post-it notes or a small piece of paper, and I will ask them a series of questions, and each answer they have to write in their normal handwriting on a Post-it note. So a typical first question is, what do you want to get out of this communication? Or what does success of this communication look like? And they have to write the answer on a small Post-it note. What that does is it forces them to think of the simplest and the simplest answer and their priorities in a really short form rather than in a long form. That's one thing. The second thing is to get them to think about their objective of communicating. And their objective is not just around what they want to say. Everybody can think about what they want to say, but it's getting them to think from the audience's perspective, or their audience, around what do they want their audience to think about or feel or do as a result of communicating. And that's something that really changes the way that they start to put their communication together.
How do they do that?
In terms of getting people to change the way they think, feel, or do, I have a fundamental belief that you need to connect with the person on an emotional level. And so often when we try to communicate, we try and communicate information. We try and communicate facts, because facts and telling people things and getting them to know more, we think is what is going to change their mind. But actually, that only changes the mind of people who are already on board with you. If you want to really change the minds, the hearts and minds of people, you need to communicate and connect with them on an emotional level. And the only way to do that is through the energy that you bring and the stories that you bring, rather than just the facts. Don't get me wrong, facts have a critical part in it, but the facts are there to bring a story to life, and the story is there to connect emotionally.
How do you find the stories from your clients that help people change the way they think, feel and do?
A lot of the time people don't recognise that they have stories, and everybody has thousands of stories. Some of them just, it's the way they've lived. It's just part of their experience, and they don't think it's an important part. So a lot of the time it's hours of chatting with them and just getting them to talk about anything. And sometimes the stories come in the most absurd, random or unusual, surprising times. And that's where we try and build it, because that's what builds the personality, the energy, and that's where people really do connect with their audiences.
So can it be at times when people have, when you're having coffee after in your break time and someone goes, oh, I've got this great story. We find that when people let their guard down and they think they're not actually telling, on show, is when you actually get a real gem.
100%. So a lot of the time I'll ask them to just tell me about what's going on, or tell me about their life, tell me about what they're trying to do. And I'll even say to them, we'll get to your content later, I just want to know about you. And they think we're just having a chat, and that's where you pick up some of the nuggets. So when they tell you about the content later on, you can actually relate it back and say, hey, you told me something that happened to you 10 years ago. How can we relate that? And they start to build their stories there.
Does it make a difference for people then to be authentic when they're telling stories?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that authenticity is critical in the whole process. So part of the work that I've done, I've worked with some really everyday people who have some incredible messages. Some people may have English as a second language or struggle to talk in a professional way. And my job is to keep it as authentic as possible, as long as people can understand the message. I remember one person that I worked with who had these sayings that people understood, but they didn't grammatically make sense. And when we wrote a speech for him, we kept them all in, because that was what people knew about him. And we didn't want to change any part of his authenticity. We just wanted to make sure the message was clearer.
You work with some leaders in industry and financial services and real estate and all sorts of different places. Have you got someone in particular who you loved working with who started to use stories to change the way that they work and relate to people?
I love hearing the stories. That's the best part of my job. The putting the communication part together is great, but not without hearing and learning about the stories. Most people who have something to say have some really interesting stories behind it. There was one lady that I worked with when I was working in Asia, an American lady who had spent about 30 years working in Asia and had actually been part of the same company for her whole career, and had made a shift to a new organisation in a global investment bank. And she had spent all of her time talking about the vision and the facts and the figures and the finances and the numbers and the results and the sales, and that's what had made her successful previously, because she was measured on that. And when she moved to her new company, she needed to start thinking about how she was being seen and the way that she came across to people who didn't know who she was, and she didn't have results to prove, particularly in that first year. And so I worked with her on looking at how she would present herself effectively to a new group. And she would have had thousands of people that sat within her team. And what we did was we started to think about how she wanted people to describe the feeling they had after being in her presence. So the energy that they would walk away with after being in her presence. And she said that she wanted people to feel empowered, and she wanted people to feel like they could do their job themselves. And to do that, telling all the facts and figures and her vision wasn't going to do it. So she used stories, she used her experience, and she used her questioning, and she used her ability to get stories out of other people as the way to build that rapport, and had a hugely successful introduction to a new company, despite it being the first time she'd changed roles in 30 years.
Do you think storytelling has it has a role in making us more human? It has a role in connecting us as humans more rather than facts and figures?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, we love to tell stories and hear stories, I believe, from the minute we're born. I mean, the first thing that I do with my kids is tell them stories, right? And it's the only thing that keeps them quiet as little kids as well. So I think stories are something that's so inbuilt in us. But when you think about, going back to the idea that we have to connect with people emotionally, it's the feelings that people leave with that connect us. And stories do that quickly and easily. It's really difficult to do that with facts alone. Now, as I said, facts have a part because facts will be part of the story, but without the story, facts will only connect from our heads and will only connect on a rational level. So that won't change people's minds. That just supports something that people already believe. That's my belief anyway.
You also work with the Australian of the Year Awards, a yearly project that you are lucky enough to work with. Can you tell us what you do as part of that project?
Yeah, that's an awesome project. So there's 128 nominees from around the country, and I start with them and work with them as they go through the process all the way to the national finalists and then the 4 national recipients, so the Australian, Senior Australian, Young Australian and Local Hero. And my job is to work with them to help them think about how they want to use the platform, what they want to get out of the year given there's potentially some added publicity for them, but really to refine and define their message and what they want to say to the country as one of the Australian of the Years. So helping them to clarify that, put it together and communicate it quite broadly.
How easy do they find that?
Most of the time it's ridiculously difficult and daunting for them when they start, and there is a fair bit of work. Even some of the people who you would assume are the most incredible communicators or have been in the media or communicated for longer than we can remember, they can find it really difficult because it's a very specific message that they have to choose or they choose to communicate. And it's something that's very personal to them. So it can be a really difficult task for a lot of them.
What part does storytelling play for the Australian of the Year award recipients?
Stories are everything for the Australian of the Year recipients. I mean, we're just having this conversation a couple of days ago, actually. One of the things that people find so difficult is they want to talk about their cause or their business or something specific that they've done, but actually they are nominated or they receive the award for the person they are and the values that they bring as an individual. Great, some of the work they've done or an organisation they're part of, but it's about them. And so when you think about it, the award is for an individual or a person. What makes them up is the millions of stories that have been part of their past and part of their experience. So that is all critical to it. The other thing is, like it or not, the person who becomes Australia of the Year, you've got 24 million Australians who have an opinion on whether or not they're the right person. And so part of their role is to be loved by the Australian public as well. And again, the way to do that is building an emotional connection, building a relevance with their audience. And stories is the fastest and the most authentic way of doing it, because not everybody is going to necessarily agree with everything that you say from a facts and figures perspective.
You don't ask to be nominated for Australian of the Year, so how easy do people find it to be authentic and put themselves up on that stage?
Takes a lot of time. So most people who are nominated have been nominated by someone who has been inspired by who they are or what they do. And 99.9% of people who are nominated feel like it is a group or a team effort, and that they're almost embarrassed that they're the person who has been asked to be up there. And the way that we turn it around is to let them know that this is an opportunity for them to get their stories out, or the stories of the cause, the thing that they're passionate about. It's an opportunity for them to do that. And so that then gives them a little bit of justification to tell their own personal stories, in hope that that's going to change the hearts and minds of the people that they're working with. But it's definitely a journey for them. And remember, a lot of Australian of the Years, unlike leaders of corporates, they're doing what they're doing because it's something that they have chosen and believe in. And being put on a public stage to communicate to such a large audience is definitely not something that had been in their plan or what they thought was going to happen.
Is there anyone in particular who surprised you by being an amazing storyteller?
I think that everybody can tell great stories. What's challenging is finding the stories, but I will tell you of one that was a really interesting journey for me, which was when I had the pleasure of working with Adam Goodes. So first of all, I love Adam's journey, and I love what he stands for. That always helps. But one of the things that we found is that he didn't have as many stories as I thought he would at the start. But as we started talking, we realised he had more stories than he knew what to do with, but he didn't recognise them as stories. So the stories around how every morning at 5 or 6 a.m, the discipline that he went through was exactly the same as though he was getting ready for a grand final, and how he did that. He didn't think that was a story, because that's just training. That's every morning for him. That's 6 days a week during the season. Whereas when he really talked about it, we could see how many incredible stories there were. So it was wonderful to pick stories that weren't the ones that you would normally see on camera, on TV. They were the ones that were his personal stories that nobody else knew about. And once we brought them to life, it made an even more compelling story for him.
Did he talk about how that felt for him to go through that process?
Yeah, and again, this was a fascinating experience because he had done it so much and the discipline was there. It became part of his life. But when he really took a step back, he could remember what it was like when he first started, the feelings that went through, and how his coach motivated him to have that discipline as well was quite phenomenal to hear.
What is it like for you to work with the Australian of the Year finalists?
Oh, it's my favourite time of the year, I have to say. So, you meet 128 of the most incredible people around the country, and you get to hear about their stories firsthand. You get to hear about why they do what they do, what motivates them, what their challenges are, what their dreams are. And that can be anything from a medical professional to somebody who is passionate about getting rid of plastic, to somebody who has had a horrific experience but turned it around for the good of the country. And sitting there hearing their journey and their stories is the greatest privilege that I have in my job.
Do you have a favourite story to tell?
So one of my favourite stories is actually one that I learnt through my work, talking about taking responsibility. And funnily enough, it's one that my daughter and I talk about now. So my 9-year-old daughter will often say to me, "Just remember the ham sandwich, Mum." And the story goes like this. There's quite a famous photo of some of the builders or the workers having lunch on quite a high crane when they were building the Empire State Building. And there's 2 men looking down at a lunchbox. One of the men opened the lunchbox and says, "Oh man, my wife made me a ham sandwich again. I hate ham sandwiches. The next day, the same thing happens and he opens his lunchbox and he says, oh man, I've got a ham sandwich today. What do you do though? You're 100 feet up, so he eats the ham sandwich. The next day, he opens his lunchbox, he looks in, and he goes, oh man, I've got a ham sandwich again. So the man next to him says, mate, if you don't like ham sandwiches, why don't you tell your wife? And he says, you keep my wife out of it. I made my sandwiches myself. And the moral of the story is, how often do we do this where we complain about something we don't like, but actually it's something that we've created ourselves? So I love the story because it's so visual and because everybody can understand it and because we cringe at how often we do it ourselves.